Welcome to the Wildlife Wire. I'm Mark Searles,
And I'm Samantha Miller.
and this is your source for wildlife news and the people that make it.
Today on the Wildlife Wire, we're welcoming back friend of the pod, Emma Halverson, the executive director of Wild Fish Conservancy, beyond her coveted role as our first return guest. Emma has an impressive background in fisheries, from field research in Alaska to public health campaigns in Vermont, and now leads Wild Fish Conservancy from Seattle, Washington. Emma has been at the center of the groundbreaking return of fish traps to the Pacific Northwest, a historic fishing method making a comeback on the Columbia River for the first time in nearly a century. Welcome, Emma, and we'd love to get started today by maybe you could share with our listeners who may or may not know. Could you get started by telling us what is a fish trap and how does it work?
And
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, wait, Mark's got a
welcome
question.
back too. You're
Yeah.
like a salmon who has returned back to the spawning grounds.
Well, I was just going to say, I did not know I was your first return guest. And I feel very, very honored. So I'll start with that. But
Wow.
yeah, it has been this summer, 2025, has been a true milestone for our organization and for salmon recovery because of this revitalization of fish traps, as you were saying, Sam. And so fish traps are not actually a new tool. It's a form of commercial fishing that has been used dating back, I want to say 5,000 to 7,000 years throughout the Pacific Northwest, maybe even further, but I don't want to be inaccurate. And these are essentially indigenous commercial fishing tools that were used in river because we know that, well, we see today most salmon fishing in the last 100 years, we often think of boats out in the ocean, trollers fishing far from our rivers of origin where salmon return, but for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, indigenous people fished in or near rivers of origin with tools like fish traps, reef nets, or other selective tools, we would call them. And it's been, and what we've seen is, I guess maybe part of this story is how we changed how we fish. So we had these, ancient alternative tools. Well, I guess they weren't alternative at the time. They were just ancient tools.
Yeah.
We shifted fishing out into the ocean because, in a very simple thinking, we were, why would we wait for fish to come to us in river if we could, start chasing fish out into the ocean, thinking that would be a very simple change. And over time, over the past 100 years, we've been doing this ocean fishing. We've actually seen that that's causing a lot of problems. And now scientists have really identified the need to shift back to these indigenous styles of salmon governance and management and the actual tools that they were using. And so fish traps, again, is just one example of these selective tools, but it has been so amazing to have kind of done research to understand why these tools were so effective, to modernize them to meet the needs of today's salmon recovery problems, and to now see in 2025 these tools fishing from Oregon to British Columbia by Oregon, Washington, and First Nation fishers. So it's just been an incredible milestone. And
So what you're saying is, so what fish will do is they return to their natal rivers and streams, and then fish traps catch all of the fish, that might go through them. But you can tell if one is a native or wild-born fish or a hatchery fish, and then choose which fish to harvest. Is that how they work?
yeah, and I guess before kind of diving into the mechanisms of the traps, I think just like a clear thing to understand is one of the core problems that we see in salmon recovery is the ways that we're harvesting. And unlike thousands and thousands of years ago, where we had pretty much all of our salmon populations were doing well, they were all very strong, they were healthy, we all know that's not the case today. Most of our salmon populations are doing very poorly. And so what we see is that when you fish out in the ocean, or if you fish in a river with tools that do not allow you to release fish that you didn't intend to catch unharmed, you're actually contributing to the decline of, or you're, I guess I would say, more impeding recovery. And so, as Sam was saying, if you are fishing, for example, in the Columbia River, you have many different stocks that are returning to the Columbia River, steelhead, chinook, coho, But even if you just look at one species like Chinook, you have populations that you have wild fish that may be doing better and are harvestable right next to hatchery fish that are produced for harvest. And so really the name of the game is, how do we create alternative commercial fishing tools for fishers that will allow them to target those fish that they actually want to catch and release those fish that need to recover so that they can reach spawning grounds. And so it's a way that you can actually fish and create more resilient fishing opportunities, but you're also aiding recovery. And I guess I would just say that's in contrast if we're just looking at the Columbia River and many rivers throughout the coast. When you're fishing in river, gill nets have been one of the primary tools over the last 100 years. And if you're not familiar with the gill net, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a net that is stretched across a river from a boat. But I'll say that gill nets are not evil tools inherently, but they're not tools that are meeting the needs of today because they physically ensnare fish by their gills, by their fins. And it is when you catch a fish with the gill net and you might say, oh my God, this is a fish that I really shouldn't have caught. It's a wild fish from a population that's not doing well. Even if you release that fish, it's very unlikely to survive. And so fish traps, we've been doing research since 2016 to really show that this is a passive tool that can allow fishers to harvest those fish that they intend while releasing those fish that need to recover. And this is something that scientists have been identifying for decades as a primary need for salmon recovery, to reduce the issue of bycatch, which is, catching fish you don't mean to catch or killing fish you don't mean to kill. And it's actually in Washington and Oregon been part of state policy for like going on 30, 40 years now. And so you can see why it's so exciting that here in 2025, we're seeing, the implementation of these tools really for the first time.
Yeah, this is really fascinating because when we first started corresponding about this, I'm coming from, and Sam is too, from the world of mammals. And so my first thought was Emma is against these traps because that's typically our stance in that world. And you're shedding light on a different story when we're talking about salmon. So I have a couple of questions. First, just like the general description of these, and then and how, like, are they like a box, like a big box that they swim into, and then also we can get into how, like, if this is a positive way to fish,
Mm-hmm.
is it at the moment becoming an additive
Mm-hmm.
fishing style while encouraging folks to transition away from gill nets or open water fishing to this type of fishing?
Yeah, and maybe I'll just jump on your second question, because I think that's the really, really important piece, which is that in my mind, fish traps are a solution, not the end all be all solution for salmon recovery, but they're one really important solution. And not just fish traps, all of these selective gear types that operate in river, because we have identified as scientists that fishing in the ocean is causing all of these problems. And we talked about that on the last time I was here when we were talking about actually killer whale recovery. Making salmon smaller, making them less diverse, making salmon less fecund, indiscriminately harvesting weak stocks right next to healthy stocks. So we know fishing in the ocean is a problem. We know we need to shift back to how we used to fish sustainably, how indigenous communities fish. But if we don't have the tools that fishers can transition to, that's not really possible. And so part of the solution has definitely been to reduce bycatch in rivers, but it's also part of this broader strategy of how do we create more sustainable tools that are, again, I keep saying resilient fisheries, which is kind of like a buzzword, but most fisheries are seeing that the fish that they're harvesting are not doing well, and people are having to choose to kind of get out of fishing altogether if they're going to try to sell their boat, if they're going to pass this on to their kids. And so it's really important. I feel, living in the Pacific Northwest, salmon is, salmon fishing, just the relationship humans have with salmon. We have to have salmon fisheries, but we have to have fisheries that are part of the solution. And so, again, part of why we wanted to develop these sustainable in-river techniques was to aid that transition from the ocean. But then on the second piece, once fish return to a river, you still have different stocks and you still need to be selective. Um, but I think we should dig into that piece of just like, what does a fish trap look like? Because it's interesting that you kind of honed in on that term fish trap. They've also been called pound nets in the past.
Huh.
And more modern. So obviously we have these thousand-year-old fish traps that were more, sticks and rocks. And but in the last one, like I would say like century, fish traps were kind of a modernized tool that were used in the Columbia River and around Washington and Oregon and Alaska. And they're fixed gears, which is different than how we think of fishing, a boat that's moving around to catch fish. These are gears that stay in one place. They're often, why they would be called pound nets is they're pilings, untreated pilings that are driven into the riverbed. And you have if you can think of starting at one bank of the river, you have what we call the lead, which is a series of pilings with nets that go down to the river bottom that are perpendicular to the river's bank. And then essentially that connects to a circle of pilings called the heart. And really the best way to describe how fish traps work is it's just like a passive funneling of fish. So fish swim upriver. They're naturally trying to find their way around barriers. So they hit the lead. They try to go around it. They enter the heart. And then from the heart, they're funneled into an even smaller area and finally into what we call a live well. And so the key is what we know in commercial fisheries that causes mortality is entanglement in nets, exposure to air, overcrowding, and human handling. So really, as we were developing these tools for, this, modern day scenario, we were thinking, how can we eliminate all of those issues? And I see Sam with a question. So I'll pause there.
I do. No, I'm curious, as the fish go through this process, and it's a passive process for them, and they're kept in these live wells, I am hearing commercial fishermen in my head saying, well, this process takes too long, or this is too cumbersome, or this isn't practical from an economic stance. How do we counter those arguments? Are those the kind of pushback arguments that you're hearing? And is technology helping making these just more intuitive too?
Yeah, I think if I had to say the biggest barrier to reintroducing these tools that have not been used for, about 100 years, I think change. Just
Right.
humans' willingness to accept change, which I'm guilty of. We are not good at accepting change, and particularly commercial fishing. People have invested in their gear and their tools, and even just a way of fishing, and so that is a big barrier. But when we actually look at what does the fish trap offer? How is it different? How does it compare? One thing we see is the biggest cost for most fishers, because they are not fixed gears, is fuel and gas. So one benefit of fish traps is that in terms of climate change and carbon emissions, you run a fish trap off of a single car battery and solar panels. So for that, you're eliminating some of those costs. We also see, and this is a really important piece to understand, and I'll try to explain it clearly, because many fishers are harvesting fish right now non-selectively, meaning they can't release unharmed fish that may be, for example, protected under the Endangered Species Act. Well, we know that if you're harming species that are protected, you can only do so much harm, because we have rules in place that say, if we do too much harm, then we might be driving these species towards extinction. And so under the Endangered Species Act, there are kind of limitations that we have to then place upon our fisheries. And if a fishery, using a gill net, for example, is killing both wild fish that are listed and maybe some hatchery fish that are intended to be harvested, it can really limit the amount of time that they're allowed to fish, at the same time that we know they're doing harm to a population we're trying to improve. So there's the financial question, and then there's also the ecological value of you're fishing in a way that's increasingly giving fishers less opportunity and also harming the very resource that the fisheries depend on. So with fish traps, because you're releasing all of your wild fish, you're doing less harm to those threatened and endangered species, which means under the ESA, you could fish longer. You could even maybe catch less fish and get a higher price per pound because you'd open the door for things like sustainable certifications, which in fisheries that are killing high amounts of threatened and endangered populations, that the Columbia is a great example. There's not a single fishery on the Columbia River today that is certified by any certifier. And as we have been doing our research and part of the story I didn't really tell is that this year, for the first time, there will be a legalized commercial fish trap fishery on the Columbia River. And certifiers are really excited about that because they're looking for these solutions in fisheries that really haven't come along in the past 30 years of how do we still allow fishing, still allow consumers to access, this important resource, but also not continue harming these populations that the fisheries depend on. So I would say, I think that upfront costs to build these tools are a challenge. And that's why our organization has really been trying to identify what those barriers are to entry for fishers, these progressive fishers who want to transition to these tools. But I think over time, the long-term benefits, right now we're kind of in a value loss and an ecological loss. Change is hard, but it could result in economic gain and it could result in rebuilding these stocks. So I think that it is a difficult question, but it's one that we have to think over a long period of time. And one of the reasons I'm so excited about this summer is that these fish traps have operated almost for a decade now on a more experimental basis, on a test fishery basis. This will be the first year we can really start to demonstrate that economic kind of competitiveness with other fisheries. And that is kind of one of the research goals of this year.
And for folks that are stuck like I am on visualizing these things, do y'all have an example on your website? I'm still trying to wrap my head around like how big they are, and then how are people selecting the fish once they're in there, or is it selecting by size? Like how that is working?
Yeah. So and when I was kind of describing the function of the fish traps, that last box, the live well, what's so incredible is that we now have underwater cameras in the live well, so you can identify the fish from a screen without having to, handle them yourself. And then there's a door on the live well that you can open. And so if you are a fish, say a wild Snake River Chinook that's coming down the Columbia River, you can move through the trap, enter the live well, be identified, the door could be opened, and you could continue migrating upriver to your spawning grounds. And what our research has shown is that there's no measurable difference, essentially, to a fish just swimming upriver to a fish swimming to the fish trap. So that speaks to the passive nature. In terms of the selectivity, it really depends on the system. So in the Columbia River, we have robust hatchery populations. So in the Columbia, that is what fishers primarily are trying to target. Again, the tools available to them now, which are gill nets, don't allow them to release wild fish. So they're killing wild fish and hatchery fish. The goal of introducing these fish traps would be you can release 100% of the wild fish passing through and only target hatchery fish. And that is, for listeners who are wondering, how do you know if a fish is a hatchery fish or a wild fish? There's actually a fin on the back of a salmonid, a salmon, or a steelhead called an adipose fin. That's between the tail fin and the dorsal fin on top. And what they actually do with juvenile salmon that are hatchery bred, meaning fish that are born in buildings that are fed by humans and then released into the wild with the intention of supplementing fisheries, they clip that little fin. And what's interesting is the reason they clipped that fin, and the reason they started doing that 30 years ago, was to make way for these types of fisheries that would allow for the harvesting of hatchery fish and the release of wild fish. And so, kind of to your point, Mark, it's usually on the Columbia, they would be fishing by species. So steelhead, for example, are a population that are not harvestable. They are in really, really dire condition. And so all of the steelhead that pass through the trap are immediately released. Chinook and coho are two two species that are harvested, and those would be, are they wild? And if they are, we would release them, and if they're not, we would harvest them.
So I again have a follow-up question on this. And so when the fish are going in, you said there's like typically a camera there. So there's someone there with like a button that would allow that fish or those fish to go through. And so it's kind of like live monitored as the fish are coming. And when they're entering into these traps, are they making it through kind of one at a time or small groups? I'm wondering, like, would there be a scenario where a large number of fish come in that are both wild fish and then also hatchery fish? And like, how would you work with a scenario like that?
Yeah, so it's the way it kind of works is you have that heart I described, which is kind of that first major chamber the fish move into. And that chamber is much larger. And so you can kind of keep majority of your fish flowing through there. You have the specificity to kind of move fish into the live well, which is that kind of smaller chamber. And then you shut the door so that you're not overcrowding fish. Which
Gotcha.
again is a key, is how do you, not overcrowd fish so they're not smushing each other, they're not damaging each other. Again, the nets are a really fine mesh that are, around these kind of segments so that the fish are not getting ensnared. And then there's actually a physical door that after you've identified a fish through the camera, you open the door, they swim out. You close the door, you can open the front door and they can swim in. Another method that can be used, which was our kind of original method when we first started asking this question of just, are fish traps even a good tool for, reducing harm to fish? Because we know they were a good tool, and indigenous people even used them selectively thousands of years ago to select by sex or select by size, as you were saying. Today, we know we just need to limit the mortality to as little as possible, which, given how poorly our populations are doing, even a tiny bit of mortality is actually a lot of harm. And so what we did between 2016 and 2020 was to not harvest fish at all. We just tagged every single fish that came through the fish trap and used what's called a pit tag. And we picked the Columbia River because it's one of the most challenging systems. If you can get this accepted by management and fishers on the Columbia, you can do it anywhere. But also the Columbia has a series of sensors for these pit tags all the way up until Bonneville Dam. And so what happens essentially is you tag these fish, you release them, and then you can measure how far these fish are making it. And what our research showed was using originally we used what was called a brailing method. So instead of that like passive live well box with the doors, we were using kind of a fine mesh net that would be lifted and kind of used to kind of funnel the fish into the live well. And so because they were touching that net, because they were exposed to air, because they were crowded, we saw a little bit of mortality, but our initial data showed 96% of Chinook released were surviving to, 7-day migration over 400 kilometers upriver. And I think it was 94.4% for steelhead, which again is kind of this limiting stock on the Columbia because they're so poor. And then when we switched to that passive method, we were seeing essentially, again, this is an experiment, but we were seeing 100% survival of all of the stocks that we tested. And I'm not aware of any commercial fishing gear anywhere in the world that can say we've done research that's demonstrated zero bycatch mortality. 100% of the fish that moved through this gear survived over, not just like, did they immediately die after they left? Did they survive over time? So it's actually a pretty impressive finding.
And so what again was the average size? So you said that they're fixed, they're coming perpendicular from coming from the edge of the river. So are we talking 50 feet long? Or are we talking much smaller, much bigger? I'm just really trying to wrap my head around this.
Totally. And so we have now 3 fish traps on the Columbia, one on the Oregon side, 2 on the Washington side that have been built between 2016 and 2025. And they're different sizes. One kind of complicated piece to the story is that fish traps were actually banned in Washington state and in Alaska because they are extremely effective at catching fish. So to your question, if you put a lead that goes all the way across the river, you're going to catch almost everything that comes into that trap.
Right.
What we had seen in the, before fish traps were banned was that many of these fish processors owned the fish traps. Many individual fishers were fishing with gill nets, and there was really poor management. And so the leads were allowed to go really far into the river. And what was happening was that, these big commercial processors were catching everything, and these gill netters felt that they weren't getting as much opportunity. So they banned these fish traps, and they're still banned today. We are operating them legally this year for the first time under kind of a special rule. But what's also interesting is that after fish traps were banned, the number of fish that were caught did not actually decrease. It was just that the gill netters caught more fish. And so I think your question is really important because the failure of fish traps in the past has been the poor management. And so that is something that the Department of Fish and Wildlife now has limitations on. How far can the lead go out? And I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but what I would recommend is I'll share a couple resources that show kind of from an overhead view, and we have some videos. So anyone who's listening who wants to kind of get a better sense of like, what does this look like, can actually see it in operation. The other thing I'll mention is that fish traps are just one tool in this toolbox of selective gears. There's another tool called reef nets, which are also an ancient indigenous tool that are endemic to like no other place in the world than Puget Sound here in Washington. There are fish wheels that are being used. There are beach seines. And what's neat about this package of tools is they're all selective in that way of releasing fish that we don't want to kill unharmed, but they all work in different systems of the river. And so fish traps might work better in one type of scenario. If you're getting into like a smaller tributary, a fish wheel might be a better option. And so part of this goal is there are groups kind of working throughout the region to say, how do we develop fish traps are not everyone is going to transition to fish traps. This is just one example. And so I'll just end on saying like they're very scalable. Every single fish trap I've seen looks completely different. It's different size depending on what system it's in, what the goal is, and what the regulations are.
I have so many follow-up questions. But
he wants to know exactly how tall they are.
I will yield my time right now to Sam.
Yes, to come back 3 times. So,
well, next time you come back, Emma, we'll just give Mark an hour to ask descriptive questions about the fish trap so we can all get the perfect visual of what it looks like in our heads. But I think the best thing to do would probably be to link images in our podcast, and that way people can see what they look like. And that does solve a question for me. I was wondering, do fish get past them, but they don't go all the way across the river? So some fish will go past them and some fish will go into them. And that makes a lot of sense to me. Beyond, they're highly effective. That's why we stopped using them, because people were overusing them or using them too far across. What other challenges do you anticipate as this moves from a research-based solution to really being an active commercial fishery, which you're starting on the Columbia this September? So what are some other challenges we could face with this type of commercial fishing?
Yeah, I think what I said earlier is change is the biggest issue. We can develop as scientists the best tools available in terms of minimizing harm, but we need real fishers to see the value in them and want to use them. And so what's really amazing about this year, so I talked a lot about the Columbia River. We have this emerging fishery, which actually I texted our fish trap manager today who kind of runs this project. And I think today or tomorrow is going to be the first day of fishing, which is really exciting on the Columbia. But we also have 3 projects with First Nation partners in British Columbia. And I think one of the biggest barriers to date has just been not having working models. We've had these concepts, we've had these peer-reviewed papers, we've had these videos that show the tools and how they work, but we haven't had tools operating commercially where fishers are operating these tools, they're harvesting fish, they're taking them to market. And this is really opening up an important opportunity to actually bring fishers out to, and we have been doing this throughout time, but again, when you operate in a research setting, even a test fishery, you're operating under all of these constraints. And so this will be the first year that we can really demonstrate the power of this tool in a fully operational setting, bringing out those people from the certifiers, bringing out fishers on the river who, might not even want to transition, but just want to see how it works. And often what we find is when fishers have come out, maybe who fish in the gillnet fishery, they kind of kick the dirt and,
Yeah.
they're actually impressed because it's a really efficient operation. It's something that's like easy to operate with only, 1 to 3 people. It's very safe. And so I think that's one of our challenges, but also an amazing opportunity this year. I also think this transition from ocean fisheries to selective gears, this transition from in-river non-selective tools to selective tools, we need governments and management to recognize the need and the value of these tools and to be making it possible to identify the barriers. We actually are getting ready to release a white paper for the Columbia system specifically that identifies all of these remaining barriers, 7 levels of permitting that these fishers have to go through to permit these traps, high upfront costs that they need some kinds of subsidies or upfront grants. We need to change rules. We have rules in the Columbia River right now that bar youth and minority from fishing because of how we have kind of in fisheries have kind of been, as fishing opportunity declines, we've kind of only allowed people who have been existing fishers to have those opportunities. So youth and young people who often are the most open to change and the most concerned about sustainability have been really barred from participating in these fisheries. So I think there are many, many barriers. There are rules that cap, how many fish can really be, like the allocations for selective gears on the Columbia in Oregon. So even though Washington is doing this amazing emerging fishery for fish traps, we're still affected by Oregon's rules. So there are a lot of, I guess I would say, kind of policies, management changes that really need to be made if we are serious about encouraging fishers to use these tools. And I'm really hopeful that this white paper, which is kind of trying to shed light on what are these, issues between, so that maybe for listeners who aren't from Washington, the Columbia River is very strange because it's smack dab in the middle of Washington and Oregon, and both states have both the authority and the responsibility of managing this river. So when we're trying to make decisions about, how to most sustainably fish, these states have to get together and make decisions together. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. And that can mean that if one state is trying to advance a project that actually is a lot of benefit for reforming fisheries in a way that's good for fish, and the other state is just not interested, that's a huge barrier. And so I think, Sam, that's probably one of the things that I'm thinking about the most. And the Columbia is such a unique area, whereas in Canada, where we've been working with these First Nations, we don't see those same exact challenges. And we've seen there the government being very open to funding those projects and the permitting going much easier. But I think management agencies accepting that the status quo is not working and trying to support fishers who want to transition. Actually, Mark, you said something earlier, which is like, is this just another fishery? And that's another problem, which is that the way we have tried to introduce this is a tool that's open to fishers who want to transition while not affecting other opportunities. But that is another fear that fishers have, both recreational fishers who sometimes are concerned about commercial impacts, both commercial fishers who already fish. Is this going to take away from my opportunity by allowing, these new gears to operate? So that's another big barrier.
So you mentioned, governments getting involved with this. And, one of my first thoughts was, what if the Fish and Wildlife Services were the ones who put these traps in place and then leased them out? And because another concern I'm having, it would reduce the barrier of entry, right? Because you're just paying a lease versus having to fund all of this equipment up front, and you've never done it before, and you're leery about, is this going to work or not? And then the other piece is there's with a river, I mean, you're going to have a finite amount of space that you can set these up, and so um, we obviously don't want an entire river full of these things because that's going to also be counterproductive and have an ecological impact. So it is currently the model to have everyone go through the permitting process and get all through those steps you had mentioned, and then they own their trap, or is there a different model that could be used where it would be like a leasing type situation?
I think that's a great question, and I think both options could work. Right now, the way that the traps that are currently on the Columbia River have come to be is through many research grants, some from NOAA Fisheries at this highest level, from the state legislatures. So many of the projects have been kind of come to life through these investments by government at different levels. This year is interesting because, as you know, the research organization attached to these, working alongside fishers, we've really held a lot of responsibility for some of the liabilities. You know, being responsible for removing the pilings if something were to happen where the trap wasn't allowed anymore. This year is interesting because we've now handed it over, and these fishers, they own these traps. These are their traps that they will own into the future. One system that I think could work really well are cooperatives, where fishers own traps as a cooperative. That's something we'd really like to look into. I think it'd be great to see some of these certifiers who will fund, so many fisheries, grant type projects, throughout the country and throughout the world, really starting to help invest and help fishers transition to these tools. Um, but I think that's the beauty of it. We have gotten to this point through the system that exists today, but there are so many possibilities for how these could be managed, how they could be cooperatively owned, how they could be funded. But I do think we need to break down barriers like permitting, break down barriers like funding, and break down barriers like just anything that's preventing people from transitioning who truly want to.
Yeah, and Emma, I'm wondering if you could, tell our listeners a personal story. I know that recently that you visited the Skeena River trap, and I'd love to know what that was like for you, what that experience was like, and, how you related to fishing that way.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So Sam's talking about a trip I took this summer, where I went up to the Skeena River, which is in British Columbia, almost all the way up near the Alaska border. We are doing a project there that's actually really exciting because it's not a pile-driven trap as I described all of our other traps are. This is the same exact model, but we're using it's a floating trap, so anchors to hold the trap in place rather than pilings that go down into the substrate. So it was really interesting for me to see, another type of tool emerging that could be another tool in the toolbox. I think one thing that's just been like so crazy and fascinating to me, again, not as a commercial fisher, not as an indigenous person, but to see these tools that were used in that region like 5,000 years ago. And there's some amazing research that's shown that, for some of these indigenous communities, like in Comics Bay in British Columbia, which is not far from one of our projects, fish traps were the center of civilizations because that's where fish were being caught. And, all of these cultural, events that surround just the cultural and food security aspects of indigenous connections to salmon. And it's just so neat to now see them revitalize, and particularly in British Columbia, to be working with, these indigenous people who in some cases have just straight out said it's amazing to be using tools that our ancestors used in the same places. Um, so I think for me, just feeling like very connected to history in that way. Um, Also, I don't know, there's just something about working with people who wanna find solutions to these problems, who are willing to go through all of those barriers that I described, who are willing to invest in these projects just to ask, "Could this work? Could this be a better way of fishing?" And it was amazing to see, in this case, the Lakwalem First Nation operating this trap on the Skeena. side by side with, fishers who we've hired, but are really just commercial fishers who work up in Bristol Bay, who are gill netters. And to see that change, like in action, I guess, to see people who have fished in very different ways, just saying like, could this work? Because we all agree that, there's a problem and we need solutions. Um, and I guess I just say too, like in the salmon world, there's a lot of like, we can't do this. We need to change this. There's not a lot of solutions that we can change today. Like we can change how we fish today. I mean, obviously not that fast, but we can't change climate change. We can't change ocean conditions, but we can change the way we fish. We can change that overnight. And so it's a really tangible thing that we can do. And the research is showing us it's not just good for fishers or salmon recovery. I came on and talked about orca whales last time. One of the biggest recommendations right now from independent scientists on what we need to do to save killer whales that are starving because they don't have access to their food is transition out of the ocean into in-river fisheries that are using selective tools that will allow us to rebuild these wild populations of Chinook. And so I think just even when I started on this project a decade ago, I think I thought about it just as like the fish trap is just in river solving this one problem of creating fisheries. And it's like, no, this is a part of a big web that is trying to bring equity to how we fish and who has access to the fish that originate from their rivers. It's about allowing the ecosystems to have the first chance to feed, like apex predators like killer whales. It's about restoring larger, more mature, more biodiverse fish in the face of climate change. And it's about creating true economic opportunities for people in rural areas who have really just seen the opposite. So I don't know. It's just one of the more rewarding projects that I get to work on.
And Emma, as we wrap up today, I'm wondering if you could leave our audience with one message about the importance of this project, what would it be?
I think what I would say is just how interconnected we see all these problems, right? We see, again, like I just described, the killer whales are starving, communities aren't having fisheries, salmon are declining. They're all really, the heart of them all stem from these same core issues. And, this is a solution that we can bring forward that is a large systemic change, but that can really bring so much positive change to all of these challenges that we see. And so I think just thinking, this to me is a project that's thinking a little more holistically about how we recover salmon, not just in the Columbia, not just in Messina, but like how do we create tools that can be applied throughout the entire coast? Because with the scale of the changes we're seeing, again, climate change, with the scale of the loss that we're seeing and the pace of the loss, with the craziness of our federal government and the resources that no longer exist or the policies and protections that no longer exist, like we need to be thinking, what are tools that can create the largest amount of change over the broadest geographic scale?
No, I absolutely agree. And that's what I love about this work is that it really gives the accountability for humans and adapts how we fish while addressing ecosystems issues, while also allowing human harvest. So I think all of that is really great to see working together. Where can our listeners find you?
Well, I would say the best place, to find me, I would say email me, call me. I'm happy to talk about this project. To find more about this specific issue, I would say go to our website, wildfishconservancy.org. The Fish Trap Project on our website has a ton of information. It'll link to those 3 peer-reviewed studies that we've done between 2016 and the present. We have an amazing showcase of videos that really show how the fish traps work. And we also have a journal called the Fish Trap Journal on our website, which is kind of our way of just communicating kind of notes from the field directly to funders and to our members. So there's a lot of great resources on our website.
And so a refresher for folks who want to support this kind of innovation, and I applaud how much time and effort you spend on solutions and figuring out how to make this work without just a complete prohibition on salmon fishing and folks eating salmon. the labeling is always super confusing. Everything looks like it's the best product out there that is and been caught in the most sustainable way. How does someone who wants to eat salmon uh, know which ones are the right ones to pick? And is there a specific way that they can uh, advocate for, this work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a loaded question. I would say that certifiers are still a great tool. I think we have a long way to go with encouraging our certifiers to acknowledge some of these problems I've been talking about that aren't currently reflected in certifications, but I think certifications still give a good grounding for where you should start looking. But I think I would say don't just trust a certification. I think one tricky thing is not where were your fish caught? It's where were your fish actually from? Fish that are caught and certified as wild Alaskan Chinook might be threatened Chinook from the Snake River because they're caught in the ocean. So that's a big one. I generally encourage consumers not to eat Chinook salmon that are wild from the Pacific Northwest because our southern resident killer whales are quite literally starving to death, and that is their primary food source. And big mixed stock ocean fisheries that intercept those Chinook and also harm kind of the diversity of those larger, older Chinook. So that's one that I, across the board, kind of encourage people to avoid. But I think at this point, we're really at a place where we need consumers to be demanding these larger reforms that we need to be getting involved in advocating for this transition out of the ocean. And so I think personally, where we're really focused is trying to encourage local politicians in Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia to have more of a say about what happens out in the ocean. Because most of the fish that are leaving our rivers are being caught in the ocean. So we should have a say over. But yeah, what to eat and what's sustainable is a tricky question. One thing that is exciting is that some of these fish from the fish trap will be available this year. And I am hopeful that we can kind of help some of these fishers with marketing. So also sign up for our newsletter if you want to be made aware of those opportunities. But unfortunately, it's not an easy question because we need some major, major, major reforms. And that's what we're working on. So I guess I would say become a member, learn more about these issues, and yeah, just be a thoughtful, deliberate, curious eater, and be a reasonable skeptic.
What a perfect way to end. Thank you again so much for being our first second time guest on the Wildlife Wire. This has been an episode of the Wildlife Wire with me, Mark Searles, and my co-host, Samantha Miller. Thank you for listening.